So what is the context of this discussion, and how am I going to be difficult with each of the panellists here, which I'll introduce shortly, is that we have an incredibly stretching house building target, 1.5 million homes. In the decade that the Conservatives were in government and still able to do stuff, our target was consistently 1 million, which we never met. So it just gives you an idea of just how stretching that target is, coupled with the fact that private capital that has been used to fund house building is contracting. The balance sheet, the government balance sheet is contracting. There is actually, in real terms, less money available to subsidise new house building. And generally speaking, the mortgage market is not doing what it ought to assist people onto the housing ladder. So I'm sure you'll all agree, huge challenge, huge will, I think, in government, all governments, to be able to tackle it. And so I'm delighted to have three eminent experts with me today to help us dissect some of this. So we have Stephen Aldridge, Director of Analysis and Data at the Ministry of Housing, the man that provides the evidence that helps policy being developed. Anthony Breach, Associate Director, Centre for Cities, which is a wonderful organisation that says brilliantly punchy stuff that I love, but I'm not sure everybody will in this room, so I'm just going to put that out there now. And Miles Gibson from the Department of Land Economy, former civil servant, reformed civil servant, maybe, I don't know. I don't know if you think differently to when you were inside government, but at the University of Cambridge. So I'm going to give each of the panel an opportunity to set out their stall. I will take chair's prerogative and ask them one difficult question each, and then we're going to open the floor. Thank you. Stephen, we're going to start with you.
Right, fantastic. Look, thank you for inviting me. I think my purpose in my remarks is to try and help structure our discussion and to tease out where evidence and expertise can help policymakers grappling with housing supply issues. I'm going to try to do four things: set out what the housing problem as I see it is, to discuss whether our housing problem is largely or entirely a supply-side problem or something more, to set out where this takes us in terms of the policy response, and then very briefly to suggest some possible priorities for further research. So in my view, the essence of the housing problem in this country is that housing has become increasingly unaffordable over time. So in 1997, the ratio of median house prices to earnings in England was 3.5. In 2024, it was 7.7. And in some parts of the country, the change has been even greater. So in London and the South East, it's risen from 4 and 4.2 respectively to 11.1 and 9.6. Why has this happened? Well, analytical work by the Institute for Fiscal Studies has shown that the price elasticity of housing supply is low in this country compared with pretty well most other developed countries. And cumulatively, the Centre for Cities, thanks to Anthony's brilliant work, and others have estimated there's a shortfall in housing supply in this country of up to 3 to 4 million units since the passing of the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. The result has been rising land values and house prices relative to incomes over time, and thus increasing housing unaffordability. And the restrictiveness of our land use planning system has in turn been compounded by case-by-case development control as opposed to zoning rules-based systems that they have on the continent, and by the decision-making that takes place at the lowest tier of local government, which is much more vulnerable to capture by NIMBYs. Moreover, we've tended perhaps not always to build houses in the right places. So a few years ago, Paul Cheshire at London School of Economics noted that Barnsley and Doncaster saw 56,000 houses built between 1980 and 2018, whilst Oxford and Cambridge saw only 29,000 houses built during the same period. By contrast, population growth was 29,000 in Barnsley and over 95,000 in Oxford and Cambridge. More recently, a study by the Institute for Fiscal Studies has found the price elasticity of supply has been especially low in dense urban centres such as London. The cumulative shortfall in housing supply has in turn had various effects on access to housing. So over the past 20 years, overall home ownership rate has fallen from 64% from a peak of 71%. Young people have been especially hard hit, so young people today half as likely to own their home as young people 30 years ago. And there's been an increase in the number of, for example, concealed households with young people living longer with their parents. And we've seen rising housing costs lead to increased pressure at the bottom end of the housing market, with an expanding private rented sector and severe pressures on homelessness numbers. All of this also has consequences for economic growth. Poor housing affordability limits labour mobility, discouraging workers from moving to the most productive cities. And a lack of housing density around our core cities and transport nodes limits effective city size, hampering productivity gains that could be realised through increased agglomeration economies. And there have been several studies recently, very good studies, that show a negative relationship between housing unaffordability and productivity growth, at least in London and the South East. And then rising house prices and worsening of affordability have contributed to increased wealth inequality too. So on average, between 2018 and 2020, individuals in the richest 10% of the population held 1/3 of their wealth in property, whereas individuals in the bottom 10% had no property wealth at all. And wealth inequality has been increasing across both regions and generations. So regionally, median individual wealth is £160,000 higher in the South East than the North East, largely explained by property ownership. And as I've said, today's younger generations are far less likely to own their own home than previous generations, making it difficult for them to accumulate wealth through property ownership. So you're seeing increased intergenerational wealth inequalities. Of course, shortfalls in housing supply aren't the only potential drivers of rising house prices and falling housing affordability. Some have noted that falling interest rates over a long period following the financial crash will have added to demand. But as Professor Paul Cheshire has pointed out here, as in other areas, falling interest rates can't explain alone the increase in house prices, which have risen much more in areas with the most constrained supply. Others have expressed concern that the growth of the private rented sector and the increasing availability of buy-to-let mortgages have added to housing market demand and displaced first-time buyers. Whilst, of course, there will have been such effects, the cumulative shortfall in housing supply dwarfs, I would argue, the number of first-time buyers who might have been displaced by housing demand from private landlords. Also worth noting that restrictions on housing supply also create risks for house builders, impacting on their operating model, the speed at which they release property onto the market, and driving land banking and other behaviours. The key insight, I think, is that the growth of the private rented sector and buy-to-let mortgages and behaviours such as land banking are fundamentally symptoms of constrained supply. Some have argued for interventions on the demand side nonetheless, but areas with high house prices, where houses need to be built, don't lack demand. The evaluation of the Help to Buy scheme by Christian Hilber at LSE showed it had no effect on housing supply in London and was entirely capitalised in house prices. Tackling the country's housing problems is, of course, one of the government's highest priorities, and it lies at the heart of its growth and other missions. As we've heard, the government has an ambitious target for 1.5 million net additional homes in England during this Parliament, compared with the 1 million in the previous Parliament. Government has been clear about the central importance of land use planning reforms in delivering this target, including new mandatory housing targets to feed into local plans, more proactive intervention by my department to drive up the proportion of local authorities with up-to-date plans making sufficient provision for new housing, and a requirement as well to review and revise greenbelt boundaries where housing needs are not being met, including looking at the scope for making more use of previously developed land and the grey belt. More recently, the government has announced further measures, including requiring house builders to agree a schedule for development when that development is approved, and lifting regulation on the smallest sites and reducing regulation on medium sites to help small and medium-sized builders. Importantly, in March, the Office for Budget Responsibility estimated the cumulative net additions to the UK housing stock could total 1.3 million between 25-26 and 29-30. Of this, it estimated 170,000 units are due to the government's planning reforms in England. By the fifth year of the forecast, the OBR expect these reforms to add around 0.2% to potential national output, thanks to the boost in productivity of residential construction and the increased flow of housing services from a higher stock of houses. Greenbelt land release and planning permission should enable, it argued, labour and capital to be put to more productive use on land release for development than if those factors were employed elsewhere in the economy and the land left undeveloped. Over a longer time horizon, the OBR expect these effects to build to 0.4% of GDP by 2034-35 and anticipate a further additional benefit from greater labour mobility and agglomeration effects, adding just under 0.1% to potential GDP by 2034-35. Alongside these planning reforms, achieving the 1.5 million net additional homes target will depend on, first, investment in social rented housing, where there were major announcements, of course, in the spending review. The economic case for social rented housing is strong, because it's almost wholly additional. Academic evidence shows that building a social rented house does not displace private housing for sale, and it also offers excellent benefits in relation to the costs. And because social rented housing complements rather than substitutes for private housing for sale, it can also increase the rate at which new housing is absorbed by local markets and encourage private house builders to build more. Second, there will be a need for land and other interventions to make it easier to develop large, complex and riskier sites, and for SME house builders to raise finance, making use of financial transactions under the auspices of the newly announced National Housing Bank. And then thirdly, if we want to see more housing, we need to think about how we enable local areas and communities to share in more of the benefits from housing and other development. And that's where Miles Gibson's fantastic work on land value capture and land taxation is so important. So all of these are going to have a role to play. But as Salma said, delivering 1.5 million homes will be challenging, not least because of the measures required, but also because there are other factors which I don't have time to go into, like whether there'll be enough house building workers actually to build the houses if all these other issues are overcome. And there are inevitable questions too, whether an extra 1.5 million homes will be sufficient to make an impact on housing affordability against a cumulative shortfall in supply of 3.3 to 4 million units. Challenge is considerable, and further initiatives such as the government's commitment to new towns will be important over a sort of 5 to 10 year period and beyond. There are many potential areas for further research. Some of mine include whether my diagnosis of the housing problem is the right one, whether the operating model implemented by house builders, including limits on absorption rates in local markets, competing demand from the private rented sector, and the role of demand-side measures are more important than I have suggested. There's real need for further work on the impact of regulation of different kinds on the viability of house building, and thus housing supply. And notwithstanding the great work that my team, Treasury, the OBR and others have done, I think there's more to do better to understand the impacts of housing supply on economic growth and through what channels those effects occur. But it'd be great to hear others' comments. I realise there's a great deal there to take in, but let me stop and hand over to my fellow panellists.
Thank you. Anthony?
Yes, sure thing. I've got some slides, so we can get this. All right, that's the first obstacle surmounted. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Salma, for that introduction, Stephen, for, I think, a great overview of the evidence and what the government is doing in this area. My name's Anthony Breach. I'm Associate Director at Centre for Cities, a think tank looking at UK cities in an economic context in the UK. I'm the lead on housing and planning reform at CFC. I'm going to take you through some examples of some data that we've used as part of the wider debate on planning reform that's taken place over the past decade, which has seen the issue sort of move, I think, from the fringes of political and economic debate to a place much closer to the centre. So I thought I'd just kind of illustrate some examples of what we think are some important pieces of evidence, and also set out some remaining gaps as well. Oh no. There we are. Right. So this first piece of data is looking at house building in Europe since 1955. And green refers to public house building. It's consistent throughout the slides. And purple refers to private. And you can see the UK is all the way down there at the bottom in Europe for low house building since 1955, particularly for private house building. And once you adjust for things like population growth, you even ignore the fact that the UK begins this period with much more housing per person than lots of other European countries. That deficit relative to our European peers means we're now missing about 4.3 million houses relative to the Western European average. So simply to catch up to the normal state, we need about 15% increase in our housing stock. So we don't have enough houses. Why don't we have enough houses? Well, if we take this data, looking at, again, this private and public house building in England and Wales, going back to the Crimean War, we can see quite clearly the impact of, there's ups and downs. You can see the impact of the First World War, the first white gap, second white gap is the Second World War, and then house building never recovers after that point. Why does it never recover? Because the Town and Country Planning Act 1947 is introduced at that point, and private house building in particular never recovers from the restrictions on development, the case-by-case decision-making that Stephen mentioned, and the overall policies of urban containment associated with the Barlow report, published very shortly beforehand. You can see there's actually two phases to this decline. There's kind of an immediate post-war kind of crush, and a slow tightening of the system from the 60s onwards down to very low levels in the present day. So on that first phase, where does that first phase take place? Well, it takes place in urban areas. So this is looking at data from the Greater London Authority, looking at house building in London, in the Greater London area, going back to the Franco-Prussian War, 1870s. And you can see there's this absolutely massive spike in the 1930s. That's when Metroland is built. That's when a lot of the actual quite smart Art Deco modernist flats are built, sort of towards the end of that period in Zone 1, Zone 2 London, a place like Beckenham, in 1930s and right up to the war. And then immediately after the war ends, TCPA 1947 is introduced, and house building never comes even a whisker close to its pre-war levels of house building. That's maybe fine in kind of the early periods of the post-war period when London's population is falling. But especially since the 1980s, when London undergoes this renaissance, the importance of cities to the global economy and the national economy increases, house building barely budges. It remains at this very stagnant level and has contributed to this very severe housing crisis we now see in London today. What about that second phase, that kind of slow tightening over time? Well, it takes place in the shires, mainly kind of in more rural areas. So this is data from our report, Restarting House Building series, we published at the end of last year. And it shows on the horizontal axis, essentially land values, kind of a proxy for demand. And the vertical axis is house building by percentage growth by county. And you can see in dark green, we've got big cities, all kind of clustered down there at the bottom. In purple, we've got London, sort of very expensive, but all the way down there on the right. So very expensive, but not building very much. But actually in the shires, in these kind of rural areas, you've got this really nice relationship between places that were more rural, that were more expensive to live in, there was more demand to live in them, were building more in the 1960s. So there was a nice relationship outside of urban areas. Fast forward to the 2010s, early 2020s, and that relationship has collapsed. Actually, regardless of what the house price is, pretty much every part of the country is building a very similar amount. There's maybe some variations by district. Tower Hamlets is building a bit more than Kensington, obviously. But the broad trend you see nationally, it's all swamped by a pattern where pretty much everywhere is building at the same rate. And this contributes to the spatial misallocations that Stephen was talking about, but also just in an aggregate sense, it just means we're not building enough generally because nowhere is building very much. So what does this mean for the 1.5 million? I'm not going to go too much into explaining all the details of this chart, but essentially what this means is the purple and bluish bars refer to the peak period of house building in both the shires, the big cities, and in London. And the green bar refers to the gap between that peak period of house building and their annual target. And you can see that while the Town and Country Planning Act 1947 system has previously delivered quite high house building in the shires, we're actually like a whisker close to the national target in aggregate. The big cities have kind of a third gap between their peak performance since 47 and the present. And London really has a very severe gap between its current target and what it's built at any point in pretty much the last 80 years or so. So kind of targeting house building in urban areas and increasing it and relaxing those restrictions is important just for reaching that 1.5. And I think that's it for me in terms of data that we've done and collected at Centre for Cities. I've kind of throw some kind of questions out there into the audience for sort, in case any eager beavers want to do some research of their own, some areas where we think there are still research gaps. The first is that there's, I think, still quite a poor understanding about how planning policies and how planning systems vary between different developed countries and precisely what their effects are. We know that we have a discretionary system. We're pretty internationally unusual for that. We have an internationally unusually bad housing crisis as a result. But what are the precise differences between French planning and German planning, and how do those manifest in terms of variations in housing supply and in terms of the development control process at the local level? Underexplored question, even though we have lots of planning academics in this country. Stephen mentioned that we have quite good data suggesting that our system as a whole is quite inelastic compared to other countries. What is missing is kind of the estimates or impacts of elasticities on very specific measures and very specific reforms. It's quite hard for the government to pursue planning reform as it doesn't know what the size of a particular, the impact of a reform might be if it pulls a particular lever. In some cases, that might mean that they pull a lever and it has very little impact. On the other side is the risk that if they pull a lever, it has almost too much impact and they get too much house building in ways that they're not able to politically defend. The third question is on, I think something Stephen mentioned about how do we internalise some of the benefits of house building for local authorities. Again, we have an exceptionally centralised local funding system that provides quite bad incentives. If this was changed, if we had better incentives at the local level, would we see house building increase? I think the theory would say yes, but the magnitude of that effect is not currently clear. And as Stephen mentioned as well, what is the impact of kind of greater density on house building within urban areas on improving our agglomeration effects? This is a thornier question than it might first appear due to definitions of what density is, definitions of what cities are. But I think that there's still some outstanding work to be done looking at what's that connection between more housing in urban areas where it seems that we really do need them and in the improvement to our long-run economic performance over coming decades. But that's me.
Thank you, Anthony. Miles.
Thank you. Well, the good news is that I don't have anywhere near as many statistics as my colleagues, but I'd like to thank them for that because I think it makes a point that I want to make myself. Let me just add one more calculation, though, to the mix, which is about reaching the 1.5 by the 4th of July 2029, which is 5 years from the general election. By my calculations, that would mean that since we had 221,000 net additional dwellings in England last year, 2023-24, we need to grow housing supply off that number by 10%, 10.4% to be precise, each and every year between now and 2028-2029. In other words, we need to add about 25,000 more this year, 25,000 more on top of that, 50,000 next year, 75,000 and 100,000. So a total of 140,000 by my calculations, additional homes compared with what would happen if we just did what we did last year. Yeah. So I think it follows from that the mechanisms that we have got to be at least 10% better, not just once, but 10% better each and every year. 10% more funding for affordable housing, 10% more planning permissions, 10% more whatever we think has the effect that we want to have. That strikes me as stretching, but not completely mad. It has been done before, It was nearly done in the early 2000s under Tony Blair. So the economic conditions that we're going to be experiencing in the next few years are likely to be one of the biggest influences on whether or not we meet that target. Never mind all of the reforms that the government is putting in place. In fact, you could argue that if the government did nothing, it would get quite close to the target, and that would matter politically. Anyway, so what I wanted to say was I think that my colleagues have demonstrated very clearly that we know quite a lot. We know about the housing market, we know about supply, we know about price, affordability, tenure, finance, stock. We know about the planning process. We have immense detail on precisely how long it takes to process a planning application, how many get granted, what the appeal rate is, and what some of the challenges to accelerating that number might be. We know a lot about property taxes. We know how much is paid, we know who pays it, we know what it's levied on, we know a lot, as Stephen's already mentioned, about how property taxes or indeed government interventions more generally capitalise into land prices and into house prices. We know an immense amount about local government finance, about what it's spent on, about who gets what, and we know quite a lot on a more scientific basis about environmental risks and challenges. We know about water, we know about waste, climate change, we've got models for all of those things. And in fact, all of that data has enabled us to build models, and Stephen has mentioned some of those points about what happens when you pull a policy lever. And Anthony mentioned the elasticity and the sensitivity of levers. But we can be pretty sure that if we've got £39 billion of money to spend on affordable homes, which we have over the next 10 years, you can be pretty sure how many homes you're going to get out of that. The model is very clear. The department can make very good estimates about what it's going to get. The same might be true of improvement in the performance of local planning authorities in terms of pumping out numbers of permissions. Stephen's mentioned what we know about new homes bonus. Sorry, not new homes bonus. It was Help to Buy, wasn't it? Yeah. And the fact that didn't actually add very much and entirely capitalised. We know what happens when you cut stamp duty. You get a big and rather irrational boom. So we know all those things. And we're clear, I think, about many of those relationships. And I agree with Stephen that the sort of model of causality that he has put out there sounds very plausible to me. And I agree with most of it. But the question, as Anthony has rightly said, is how sensitive is the input to the lever, to the output rather. So if you pull the planning reform lever and you change words in the NPPF, how is the OBR able to work out that means, I wrote the number down, 170,000 homes out of all of the government actions, including changes to the planning system? Just how loose does the planning policy have to be before enough permissions are put into place to allow us to build the number of homes that we want And I used to write bits of planning policy, and you have to, we're asking ourselves the question: what precise words do we need to use in order to tip the balance in local authority decisions, which are legalistic or quasi-legalistic in their decisions? So the precise words really matter here. My personal view is that there is no credible set of words that you could put in any planning policy that would get you the number of planning permissions that we need to have. That lever is almost completely ineffective, in my view, and I wrote some of it. And I say that for a reason that I'll come on to, but it's mainly because local authorities can resist it. There is a massive agent problem, which is just because you tell local authorities that they should do something doesn't mean that they will. I'll give you the example of York. York has just approved its first development plan since 1956. It has managed to evade every single intervention by central government for 60 years. The system will not necessarily do what you want it to do. And one of the key arguments I want to make today is that there is a huge gap in research and evidence and understanding, not on the econometrics and the economics of housing supply, but on the sociology and the politics. And that actually our biggest challenge is understanding how to tip the marginal objector in a local authority, or as Anthony has pointed out, actually in a city, not necessarily in the kind of stereotypical rural shire, the NIMBY kind of mentality. It's not, how do we tip the marginal objector over into saying, yes, I support this development? And what is the emotional judgment that person is making if they're a local councillor or they're a campaigner against development in their area. What turns an anti-growth area into a pro-growth area? How do we solve that agent problem? If new development lowers the tone, then what is the tone? How do we define that? And what would raising the tone amount to? How many loss of post offices and pubs and playing fields does it take? Well, no, I should say post offices and pubs rather than playing fields. How many, the loss of how many post offices and pubs causes a community to realise that the lack of growth and the lack of housing in their areas is a problem for them? What is the quickest and most credible way to reduce landowner price expectations? Why is it that farmers are often more concerned about the impact of allowing land to be sold on their reputation in the local community than it is to do with profit margins and making a quick buck? Because I've certainly heard farmers say, I'm not selling my land for development because I don't want my local community to hate me forever. And I put it to you that we understand almost nothing about these political and sociological effects, and yet they are crucial, because local authorities are in the driving seat on making planning permissions, and I see no evidence that any government, not even Margaret Thatcher, was willing to tackle that issue and to say local authorities have got no right to make these decisions in the first place. No politician has ever gone near the idea that we should have a less discretionary system, and that it should be more automatic and legalistic, and that local authorities shouldn't get a say. So we do need more evidence and data on the economic side, but my challenge would be, how can we go with the grain of understanding the local politics of this and changing people's mind? And as Salma has hinted, the area that I'm interested in is how can money help? So the research that I'm going to be publishing in a couple of weeks is about the history of land value capture since 1945, and it's about what happened to the money that was taxed out of development, who benefited from it, and did it make any difference to political support for development, which maybe we can come on to in a bit more detail, but that's my challenge.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I feel like I've learned something, even though I feel like I've been listening to this same conversation for 10 years now. Okay, let me start with you, Stephen. The sort of underlying premise of this, you know, for all these fellows in the room, is that how do we actually use the evidence? Now, you've heard that there is so much evidence available. There is a lot of research being done. So I want to take a sort of slightly different tack to the questions I'm going to ask. Stephen, firstly with you, house building and the policy levers that exist within your department are not the only thing that is impacting house building. So do you think that there is perhaps a better way to have the conversation across government to think about how one cracks this issue?
What a good challenging question. I think I would be pretty. Yes, I think I'll be pretty confident in saying I don't think these issues can be solved by my department alone, though it does have a considerable.
But the target's on your department, isn't it?
It is, but the 1.5 million net additional homes is also part of the growth mission, which is a cross-government goal. Clearly, there are others in department with whom we need to work and with whom we need to coordinate what we do. So, for example, and maybe this is implicit in some of the things that Miles was saying, it's very important that we work closely with the Department for Transport, for example. So if you're seeking to build or enable the building of more houses in a particular area, that will have implications, for example, for your transport infrastructure. As we know too, in some parts of the country, there may be issues around water supplies and water infrastructure, or there may be issues around energy and energy infrastructure. So it's really important that that we work with other departments and we think in a holistic way about the range of things that need to be in place in any particular area, and the sorts of things that Miles is talking about, how you might use the land value uplift that's created by the awarding of a planning permission to generate funding for those things is extremely important. Obviously, there's a big debate too to be had about who does what at which level of government. So in these times of devolution, what is from my department, and what do you expect of mayoral strategic authorities, for example? I mean, one of the things that has particularly struck me by some of Anthony's recent work is just how badly London comes across in this. London, of course, has had a devolved system of government for some time. Doesn't seem to have resulted in more houses being built. There's an interesting question. Why do we not? Why is there not better track record around house building in London? I find that quite astonishing. Obviously, it's been going on for some considerable period, but it's quite troubling. And recently, I've had various people from the industry come to me saying that it's very hard to put together viable propositions for house building in London. You know, there are certain London boroughs where no houses will be built for private sale in the coming few years. I just find this incredible. And I'm not sure we completely understand it. There's issues, I think, around planning, environmental regulation, building safety regulation. Again, some of Anthony's work on what you splendidly called anti-housing supply measures.
Anti-supply measures, as the minister's words.
Captures it very, very neatly. So there's most definitely things to do across central government and at different levels of government. I do. There were just two other things. One is I agree with what Miles said about words. But I do think if we were more precise, it would help a lot. So, we talk about things like the grey belt, but unless we define them very precisely, things will end up with the lawyers and lots of delay. And I do also very much agree with Miles that we really need to understand where citizens and the public are. I've already mentioned how public might look for the right infrastructure to be provided alongside housing. They may also expect there to be adequate GP services or schools alongside the housing as well. But a recent study by Demos showed that actually perhaps the majority of the public are more open-minded about housing development than we might give them credit for, provided they see the benefits for them and their communities. But again, that does need action across different departments. I'm not sure that entirely answers your question, Salma, but really good point.
Yeah, I think the point that I was trying to make, especially to people who are working in government or thinking about how to interact, is that actually sometimes you could be sat in a completely different department but have something synergistic, and actually being able to raise your hand and going out there and talking about policy and networking across could be the ticket to unlocking some of these questions and trying to share some of that evidence that's there. Now, you referenced something that I was going to ask Anthony about. And Anthony, I'm really sorry. I've got your thing up here on my laptop. The Centre for Cities, as Stephen mentioned, your 5 reforms to anti-supply measures to boost urban house building. Now, I love these measures, right? But there's one that sort of stuck out to me, and it is reforming the biodiversity net gain on brownfield sites, and your suggestion is to exempt them entirely from BNG requirements. And I just wanted to ask, again, for the fellows in the room, if they're writing something for their ministers or there's a sort of a decision that's going up, how should they be thinking about 2 competing sets of evidence, both with equal validity? I mean, one might say that it's a prioritisation question and that's where the minister should go, but just thinking about how you came to that conclusion, knowing full well that, biodiversity net gain is very important.
It's a great question, Salma. So, as you'll know, the government is currently consulting on addressing some of the barriers that BNG is presenting to ministers. So it's a very live question in the planning reform debate. I think small sites are potentially going to be exempted entirely from the BNG process, which is something that we would certainly support in principle. I think kind of one challenge that has, and you sort of see this in sort of, if you go back and you read the impact assessments for BNG and the original white papers and all of that sort of stuff, you do see civil servants trying to grapple with this question of, how do you deliver the win-win, right? How do you deliver on our departmental mandate while also ensuring that we can deliver other goals that ministers try to, that also think are important? And I think BNG was implemented in kind of an honest attempt to do that. However, I think at least, so I think first you need to be honest about if a policy will have costs on another area, then you need to be upfront and accept that. I think our proposals with BNG, we say that yes, you are going to have a few more bats in cities are probably going to maybe snuff it as a result. But that broadly, we think kind of building more houses is worth it in the context of the government's political mandate. But second, I think, is then going back, once the policy is in place, if a decision has been made, going back and checking, are the results you're getting in line with the assumptions you made that justified your initial decision? Mm-hmm. And what we found with the BNG debate is actually, not only is it the case that the costs are higher than expected for house building to deliver the nature benefits of BNG, actually the political trade-off is inversed. Like, it was originally expected that the impacts would be much lower on brownfield sites than on greenfield sites. In practice, it seems to be the opposite. Actually, brownfield sites are having much harder time complying with BNG because they have smaller, constrained sites, and they're then being forced to sort of fund the off-site parts of the system, which the ecologists are particularly excited about the BNG system delivering. So I think it's partly about that honesty in the policy creation process, but I think it's then not just evaluating, but evaluating in the context of the original decision that was made.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think also, having been the recipient of advice, I think sometimes you have to be honest that there isn't always a win-win in that scenario, and that you have to be clear about that. Yeah, you can't have everything all the time.
I definitely get the sense reading some of the BNG documents, there's a great desire for there to be a win-win, when in practice there might not be, right? Maybe at a national scale, like we can certainly have large areas protected for nature, and that's terrific. Every single development in the country, can we protect nature and also build more houses at the same time? It's probably a bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Yes. If I could just add to that, I think that what history shows us is that policies that have been implemented in this kind of space in the past have always suffered from a lack of inflexibility. So because you can't be omniscient, and you can't coordinate with absolutely everyone else in Whitehall who might have an opinion on your policy. So you just got to take a risk sometimes. And if the policy is rigidly designed so that there's no opportunity, both technically and politically, to adjust it once you start to see these adverse effects, then you're in real trouble. Yep. And it becomes a political opportunity for the opposition, who can see that you've got nowhere to go. So so politicians not hemming themselves in, which I think is the you can win-win everywhere kind of analysis, is quite important. But there's also a technical flexibility that's needed in the way that legislation is designed to be able to adjust when rapid evidence collection, and that is a real problem for the civil services, is not knowing quickly enough that something is going wrong. When rapid data collection starts to show to you that something is going wrong, you need to be able to very quickly be able to change the policy through regulatory or guidance or policy means, rather than going back to Parliament and asking for fresh primary legislation.
And just to round that thought out, so on BNG in particular, the way the Environment Act 2021 is structured is BNG must deliver a minimum 10% increase in habitats, and that is written into the statute, which is a crazy way to do it.
Yep.
Don't do that.
So any of you who are going to work on this, please take note. Mars, there's a couple of things that you've said that I really want to pick up, and I don't want to take too much time up because I really do want to open it to the audience. But first and foremost, you make me very nervous when you start talking about land value capture, because that to me says tax. And I don't know if it's just because I'm a conservative, but that scares me a little bit. Unintended consequences on growth of taxation. How do you work through that?
Yeah. I should refer you, as a Tory, to Adam Smith, who was very keen.
Yes, no, I know about him.
And to Winston Churchill.
Yes, I've read that too.
And Nigel Lawson and Anthony Barber, all of whom were in favour, Tory Chancellor Anthony Barber, all of whom were in favour of taxes on the windfall gain arising from the grant of planning permission. So we're talking about a very specific tax here. But more generally, what we mean by land value capture is tools like Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act and the Community Infrastructure Levy. So tax is the hard end of the spectrum where you don't get anything back. When we describe something as a tax, what we mean is I gave you some money and you gave me nothing back, except in the most general sense of you gave it to the Treasury and the Treasury spent it on public services. Not all land value capture mechanisms are that mean to people. In fact, most of them are not mean at all. They give you something back. They either give you the planning permission or they give you some local infrastructure. And the thing I'm interested in is when you have taxed, is the tax efficient and effective and non-distortionary of development, which is really important. I agree with you on that. But once you've got the money, what do you spend it on in a way that helps communities to see benefits from development?
Yeah.
And I mean, money can't buy you love, and we shouldn't be bribing local communities to accept development. But the way I put it is that money can protect the things you love. And there may be mechanisms by which money can be used to mitigate development in ways that communities understand. To me, this kind of $64,000 question is, do these kind of taxes distort development? And the evidence appears to be, and I think this is pretty conclusive actually, the evidence appears to be that when you tax an unearned gain, which arises purely from the grant of planning permission, this is something that the state just gave you for nothing. When you tax a windfall gain, most economists would agree that that doesn't distort the landowner's decision to sell the land into the housing market. Mm-hmm. That's a matter of economics rather than sociological questions, but the economics appear to imply that usually landowner incentives are not effective. However, if you mess that tax up, and there is very strong evidence indeed that it has been messed up repeatedly, if you impose too many burdens on the developer and you're not aware of how much windfall gain there actually is to be captured, then yes, you're going to stop really quite a lot of development happening. Development will go into non-viability, and then you get these kind of regulatory costs occurring that everyone's complaining about. And you know, Anthony's absolutely right that one of the issues with BNG is that it is not sensitive to development viability in any serious way. I would argue myself that Section 106, as a negotiated contract between the local authority and the developer, is also a high risk of not really understanding how big the windfall gain is, and that the Community Infrastructure Levy, which is levied on a floor space basis, not a value basis, is also capable of misunderstanding it. And there's a long list. There's the Building Safety Levy, there's the proposed Nature Restoration Levy, there's the Residential Developers Property Tax, there's the proposed charge on developers who don't build out fast enough. All of these things seem to me to be risks to development viability. And we need researchers to be showing one way or the other whether I'm right. I mean, I think that I am right, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't make the point. But and I'm backed up by Adam Smith and Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill and Henry George and a whole load of other people. But,
what a contradictory group of people that is.
But they all agree on this, incredibly. Yeah. So I think we're okay on that point. But what we don't really understand, and I don't think ministers really understand, is that they are producing a large number of instruments which are not as sensitive as they could be to this crucial question, and it's going to stop houses getting built if we don't get that right. Yes.
Excellent, thank you. There's lots more that I could ask you, especially on how we're going to put all of that on a political leaflet to get people backing housing, but we'll save that for another moment. Any questions from the group? The gentleman there with the blue shirt? No.
Hey, my name is Ben Wade and I'm from DEFRA. I wanted to ask something about this idea of the sort of lack of sociological evidence. Do you think there's a problem? Because I this is something I suspect, but I don't know if it's really true, that in the absence of that kind of detailed sociology, what might have happened is that because a lot of the work on this that has been done is all economics, that there's sort of the gap has been filled in the way that makes default sense to economists, which is to say, okay, there's opposition to something, that must be because somebody's protecting their financial interests in some way, and so maybe they can be bargained with, we can come to a win-win, which has led to, I think, a general sense that the core of the opposition to house building must be existing landowners who want to protect their property values. And obviously that's a big part of it. But to the extent to which I have seen some looks at the sociology of NIMBYism, it's as much a phenomenon among groups like renters in a local area who stand to massively benefit, personally, from house building in the area, which suggests that there's much more going on. And I worry that attempting to kind of design almost like a public-facing approach, like you're just saying there, how do we kind of put this on a leaflet, that just sort of assumes that what we have here is a standard sort of clash of economic interests, is going to kind of miss the mark, and that you've actually got this, that when you introduce the possibility of new house building into an area, you're not just marginally changing a situation, marginally changing people's incentives, so seeing a shift in behaviour that I think economics might quite well describe, but you're sort of exposing the sort of darker underbelly of stuff like racism and socialism that's often kind of latent in an area which you can't really buy off, as it were. If people hate markets and black people, then that's very difficult to sort of argue them out of that with money.
Thank you.
Do you think that's reasonable?
I think that's a very good point, and it speaks to some of the democratic pressures that politicians are then under as a consequence. Miles, I'll come to you, then Anthony, then Stephen, if you have a point to make at the end.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and I don't know what I think about it. But my plea is to social scientists that we really need to understand this better, and that there has been, I would say, two groups of people who do understand this. The pollsters are very, very useful people to just ask questions of and understand attitudes to development, and to tease out these issues that renters are in fact often as opposed to development as homeowners. And the second group of people is the politicians, actually. And so there does feel a bit of a disjunction between what the civil service is telling ministers about what the problem is and what politicians feel in their own constituencies about it. And sometimes I found that actually politicians are very sensitive indeed and understand very well what the real issues are, but seem to struggle to maybe get that into the policy system within government. So, for example, if it is a problem of racism, and I can't believe that there's anybody in the department that is analysing what to do about that from a housing supply perspective. But if that is what it is, then we should be looking at that. I suppose the final point to make is about what do we mean by value, and I take the point that perhaps economists are thinking, oh well, it's the value of people's property that they're worried about. I have a wider thought about value here, which is that actually the value people are worried about is the intangible value of the place that they live in, and the fear of change that they have about their place is probably partly about the value of their own property, about which, by the way, the planning system is not allowed to care. But they're more interested in, or as interested in, the fact that the playing field that they played in as a child is about to be built on, or that the historic building that defines their community is about to be demolished, and that we're not very good at understanding how people perceive value and what people's sort of willingness to pay to have that value removed from them is, or what their willingness to accept, to use the economist language again, would be in order to have that value removed, heritage value. So I think we're very bad at understanding those intangible feelings that people have about their community, what financial value they might put on it, and whether they are willing to be bought off, or whether that's just like a not going there. There is nothing you can pay me to allow me to see the cost and benefits of development differently, because I regard that intangible value as priceless, and I'm going to lie down in the road and stop the bulldozer as a result.
Anthony?
Sure. So, great question, Ben. I think the best book, which is on the problem you described by a political scientist called Catherine Einstein, Neighbourhood Defenders. So that takes it's US evidence, but it takes demographic data, like individual records of objectors, and looks at what they object to in Boston in the US, and then examines their demographic details and their behaviour and their motivations. And she finds that, one, they're advantaged across pretty much every dimension you can think of, which probably isn't that much of a surprise. But also that if you read the comments people make, they very, very rarely talk about house prices as part of their motivation. And I think people are being honest in that. I think house prices aren't a huge part of the rationale behind why people object to stuff. I think NIMBYism as a phenomenon is much more about some of these intangible things, but I describe it as a desire to monopolize local amenities, right? You've got in your neighborhood, you've got a certain bundle of things. You want to keep them. You think more people coming to your area won't expand or improve the quality of those amenities, so you just want to keep people out. I think the implication from that then is that trying to persuade hard NIMBYs to support development is pointless, right? There are some people who are ideologically opposed to development and who giving them power to get involved in the process, it's just they're going to use that power to try and stop housing, right? That's just rational and sensible. What I think it therefore means is it means changing the incentives of the real decision makers in local government who control planning permissions. Part of that is reducing their ability to block stuff, but also it's on the financial side, it's allowing them to grow their tax base so they can fund other services and, crucially, not increase council taxes just to, if they allow more development to take place.
And Stephen, is this something that your team looks at, or is there any research that you can point to that's been done around here on this?
Most definitely recognise point I was going to make was, I think there's a compounding factor here, maybe the general loss of trust in government and politicians, which make it harder over time for governments at any level to respond to these issues. I very much agree with Anthony. I think, as I said, actually the public's attitudes may be more nuanced than we give people credit for if they see the right mitigations in place. But I think people do very much worry about an influx of housing and people on their access to, for example, GP services or schools. Whether you're a tenant or a owner-occupier, you're going to be worried about those things. There may be things that could be done to promote, better informed debate. I think I read something not long ago that many young people didn't appreciate that the reason they can't afford a house to buy is that we don't build enough of them. That is quite an amazing position to be in. And it's not unique to this country, as people were talking. I don't know if anyone here has read Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance, about these issues in the United States, looking at how aversion to development in California and in New York State has led to very significant housing problems, rising homelessness problems, and indeed ultimately outmigration to states like Texas, Arizona and Florida, where more houses are built. It's uncanny to see some of the analogies, and perhaps much beholden on politicians to explain the consequences to people of some of these consequences to restricting development.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to the lady in the back who had her hand up before. And then I'll take a couple of questions. We'll come to you, and then you, sir.
Thanks. I'm Meg Groom from CSaP, and I guess kind of building on that question of trust, but also maybe on the first session from the conference about how are there examples, is there evidence of how housing can bring other benefits, whether that's through the health mission? At a recent CSaP event, we were talking not just about health prevention, but health promotion. And so are there examples where housing is actually bringing co-benefits, not just giving a house to an individual, but what are the benefits that housing can give? And are there examples of this, but also for the net zero mission, safer streets? Are there other sort of win-win examples that we can, practical examples that we can look at?
Great. And I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Meg.
Meg, thank you. Okay, and then I'll group these questions. The gentleman here in the pink shirt.
Thank you. Very interesting panel so far. I just wanted to build a little bit on the BNG point and just ask how you think you can safeguard nature whilst meeting this house building target. And personally, I think BNG has done a lot of positive stuff. We have the 12th worst biodiversity in the world here in the UK, and it's given a platform for some nature restoration in a lot of places, but it definitely does need a change in focus. And it seemed really interesting to me that a lot of the problems are in cities in terms of where we need to unlock that house building. But the kind of proposed changes to BNG at the moment are blanket in terms of that then opens up issues that areas like SSIs or places that actually have newts and bats are then threatened rather than it allows development in farmers' fields or where there's low productivity or in urban environments. So yeah, I just wanted to ask how you can safeguard nature whilst house building.
Thank you. And your name, sir?
I'm Alex.
Alex, thank you. And then we'll just come down here, please, Sarah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Friso. Bit of a maybe left field question, but you mentioned earlier, Stephen, that there isn't a huge amount of elasticity in the price of a house building, and I'm wondering to what extent the basically limited market, the limited number of major house builders in this country plays a role in that. There's essentially 3 companies that actually do any major house building in this country, and that stifles, obviously, competition and maybe reduces the incentives for major house building, and whether or not that maybe limits the effect to which the housing market is an efficient market.
Okay, and we've got our final question there.
Good afternoon. Ian Brelston from Innovate UK, former CSaP Policy Fellow. Is building on the very last point Stephen made, I wonder if we've got anywhere that's best practice the UK could emulate. We're very good at diagnosing the problems, but often very poor in the UK. We're actually copying other people who do things well. We have a bit of a not invented here syndrome. I did formerly live in Texas, but I don't think Texas is very comparable to the UK, just in terms of the size. But I just wondered whether there were other parts of the US, the world, Europe, whatever, where we can take lessons.
Thank you. So the way I'm going to split it, because we are short of time, but I want you to be able to answer the question, is Anthony, why don't you take the BNG question, and Stephen, if you take Friso's question on elasticity, and then perhaps we can go across on international comparisons on tax and the health point. Yes, thank you. We'll start off with the BNG question. We'll round the other 2.
Sure. So on the BNG question, yeah, I mean, again, really good question, Alex. So I think you're right that obviously the way the government is currently consulting on removing BNG, it is blanket. They are talking about small sites more generally across the country. I think part of the problem here is that central government struggles to think spatially, right? It struggles to distinguish in legal and policy terms between places that are urban and places that are not particularly urban. So we've suggested in our submissions that if the government is going to make a decision on this, that they focus on the metro mayor areas, basically the biggest combined authorities that already exist. I mean, I would say, nevertheless, so if you read the kind of government's justification for BNG, certainly when it was created, the government itself expects BNG to only make a minor contribution to reaching its nature goals over the period over which they have been set. So I think more broadly, we need to think about, my argument would be, is that BNG in its current form violates the polluter pays principle in that it is exposing kind of quite an important part of the economy to correcting ecological damage that has already been caused by another party already within that location over some period of time. So rather than having, if we want to fix nature, all of society needs to pay a contribution towards repairing our natural and wildlife. We shouldn't just be taxing a very important sector of the economy, which we actually need to expand quite considerably if we're going to improve living standards and social outcomes for the country as a whole.
Thank you. And then, Stephen, if you could follow on the elasticity point and then perhaps the co-benefits of health.
Yeah, let me do quickly the co-benefits. So this is an area where we're doing quite a lot of work. And I've mentioned 3 things One is we've done research with Home England looking at the wider area benefits of housing developments. So seeking to tease out not just the benefits of the extra housing that's provided or improved, but how the benefits of doing that spills over to a wider area, and we can use that to derive changes in values that we could use in our business cases. Second thing I'd say is that there's a fantastic piece of work going on at universities of Bath, Bristol and others to look at the relationships between the built environment, housing and a host of different health outcomes. And this work has identified the channels, synthesised the international evidence on the magnitude of those effects and what values to attach to them, which we will in due course build into our appraisal guidance. And third thing I'd note is that we've done quite a bit of work recently, again with Homes England, on the well-being consequences of increases of numbers of people being in temporary accommodation and how you improve people's well-being if you take them out of such accommodation. So this is a very live area and where there's some really exciting work underway. On housing elasticities, house builders, for what it's worth, I don't think the Competition Markets Authority in its various reports has concluded there is a particular problem with competition in house building markets. Obviously, clearly in particular local markets, there may be concentrations. I think nationally there's 12 major builders and their shares vary over time. No reason to be complacent, but obviously the department very much focused on, for example, trying to reduce barriers to entry for small and medium-sized house builders. And the other thing I just wanted to say was picking up on international comparisons. If you've ever been to A, California and B, Texas, you'll notice in California, especially been to San Francisco, huge problems of homelessness where of course they don't build houses in California. You go to Texas by contrast, they do build houses. So if you want a case study of the benefits of building houses, go to Texas.
And finally, Miles, just on that international comparative point, tax is probably a good point to compare.
Yes, and of course international need not mean UK and everyone else. It could mean Scotland versus England, where of course the planning systems are slightly different in Scotland, England, or other parts of the UK, or indeed even within England. So, for example, there are 160 local authorities in England who charge community infrastructure levy, and 150 who don't, which is a perfect kind of experimental sample, because you can compare and contrast the two sets and what happened and were there any effects. But to the international comparisons, yes, certainly, and the organisations like the OECD, the EU and the UN all produce comparative studies, but what it proves, I think, is that it's really very difficult to make international comparisons. I teach from time to time at Cambridge, and one thing I ask my students is to say, right, go and look at the OECD compendium of land value capture instruments. Tell me which way, and look at the UK one and choose another country, maybe that's China or Denmark or the Netherlands, and tell me which of those systems you think is better. And those students usually realise quite quickly that's a trick question. And that actually what they come back and say in their essays is, this is a trick question because what we can see from the instruments that are available in each of those countries is that they are not entirely, but they are hugely influenced by the legal structures, the institutional structures and the cultural arrangements of each of those places. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to bear in mind when we're thinking about reform here. It is really difficult to take a proposition from another country, even if it feels desirable in the abstract, and say, we're going to do that in the UK, because you're not starting from the same place that they're starting from in that other place. And you don't have those same institutional and legal and cultural structures. So I'm a bit cautious about it. What final thing I would say on that is that, of course, we also have another country, which is the past. And I'm very interested in looking at whether we can just nick ideas from the past in our own country, because at least we have the same or similar comparisons. And so, one of the things that I'm hoping to do in a couple of weeks is I'm going to be publishing research which is about the history and to say, can we go back and look at some things that almost worked but didn't quite? And can we reapply some of those lessons? Because at least we know they failed, right? Or they were successful, and we can take lessons and use those as we go forward.
So with the 2 minutes that we have left, I'm just going to put one final question to each of the panellists. And sorry to put you on the spot. You've each got 30 seconds. One thing that you would change to unlock house building. Just one thing. Go, Anthony.
So I'd replace the TCPA 1947 with a new flexible zoning system where if you follow the rules, then you can build. Quite similar to Japan's, I think, in concept, would have to be maybe a little bit different.
Stephen?
Strongly agree with that. But I'd also say if we've got some spare public money, use it to invest in social rented housing.
Miles?
I'm going to propose something equally politically unrealistic. In the tax system, if I was Prime Minister, what I would do is I would impose capital gains tax on the principal private residence at the point of sale.
This is making me even more nervous. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Please join me in thanking them for their excellent contributions. And look, guys, one final note from me. Please take advantage of the fact of being in this room with your colleagues from across government, with colleagues from Cambridge. Everyone's on LinkedIn. Please try and link in with people if you've got questions to follow up on. And keep the conversation up. I think this is the way that we learn, improve, and understand the evidence that's out there. Thank you.
Thank you.